Hey everyone, Hannah here for WGSS 446 week 3. So this week we're going to be talking about intimate partner violence mostly, but I'm also going to expand upon that by talking about family and structure violence as well. So let's get started. First, we'll do a week 2 review, then we'll go over intimate partner violence and I'll do an overview of that, followed by a more in-depth lecture. And then I'll give you the information for the anonymous feedback for that exit pass, ending with reminders. All right, so just as a reminder or review for week 2, the major paradigms within sociology and women's and gender studies that we'll be working with this semester are material and culture. So we're thinking about the actual material goods within our society as well as the cultural representation that they serve. We're looking at structure and agency. So how much agency, individual agency do people have? Are we making our own choices? And how much are social institutions organizing and structuring the types of choices we have available to us? We can also analyze social issues using a macro versus micro approach. So thinking micro, small scale everyday interactions versus macro, larger scale interactions, especially social institutions and some of the inequities that exist structurally. And then finally, we can think about race, class, and gender, which is how sociologists tend to refer to this idea of intersectionality. And then women's and gender studies scholars tend to just say intersectionality. So thinking about how identities that we have impact our everyday lived experiences, but we can also start to think about some of the ways in which things like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, and age impact social institutions and sort of provide structural inequities. All right, so for week 3, some of the videos you have to watch, they cover intimate partner violence in depth. And specifically, you watch a video where folks from the deaf community, they go over some nuances of the original power and control wheel and how this type of violence can impact members of the deaf community and some of the specific ways in which power can be wielded over folks who are part of the deaf community. Now, we can also think about the nuances of the power and control wheel in terms of other marginalized communities. So often, folks will discuss power and control and intimate partner violence specific to the LGBTQ plus community. This was especially true when we had things like don't ask, don't tell in the military, or when it was illegal to be out at school, work, perhaps in order to have housing, especially if you're renting. Now, increasingly, states have provided protection for the LGBTQ plus community. Hawaii is pretty liberal when it comes to protection for the queer community, but in other states, we see that discrimination can still occur for the LGBTQ plus community. And so one way in which an abusive partner can wield power and control over another partner is by threatening to out them. So saying, people at work don't know that you are gay or trans. If you don't do what I say or you make me angry, I'm going to out you and you could potentially lose your job, your income, things like that. Now, that's more concrete, I suppose, as far as policy or work, but also we know that for a variety of reasons, for religious affiliation or for morality arguments, people and families will sometimes not accept folks who are in their family who identify as LGBTQ plus. And so that's another way in which an abusive partner can wield power. They can say, well, if you aren't behaving the way I want, I'm going to out you to your family who doesn't know that you're LGBTQ plus. And so if we think about using intimidation, coercion and threats, emotional abuse, isolating you from people at work or in your family, we can think about some of the nuances that people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community can experience when it comes to the power and control wheel. There's also been a lot of research looking at folks who are green card holders and or who are undocumented, so folks who aren't United States citizens, and how controlling and abusive partners can threaten their status. So I watch a lot of really bad reality TV shows. One of them is 90 Day Fiance. I will admit that to you for educational purposes, because one of the things that drives me nuts is some of the folks on that show who are United States citizens and are working to marry someone who is not a United States citizen will say, well, if you make me upset, if I think you're flirting with someone else, if you're not behaving the way I want you to behave, I'm not going to apply for your green card. Or I'll take your green card away from you so you have it, but I'm not going to allow you to use it to look for employment or in order to travel to visit your family in another country because I'm taking that control away from you. And so that is another way in which power and control can manifest if one person has that sort of privilege over the other person. Now, this is an overview. Some of the other readings and articles and videos you're watching this week cover the power and control wheel in more in depth. But I really want to draw attention to this because for your power and control wheel assignment, which I'll highlight in more detail in a little bit, you will be revamping the power and control wheel for for a specific community. So that might be for the lesbian community or for the undocumented community. And essentially, you'll be going through this power and control wheel similar to that website that goes over the power and control wheel specifically for the deaf community, and you'll be updating it. So, what are some ways in which power and control can manifest for a particular marginalized community? All right, and so if we think about sort of the classic definition of intimate partner violence, it's abuse or aggression that occurs in romantic/intimate relationships. And this can include current or former partners. Also, it's important to note that IPV can vary in frequency and severity, and it can take a variety of forms. So there's not a one size fits all approach to intimate partner violence. Now, sometimes intimate partner violence can also sort of bridge out and be family violence as well. So, family violence is any form of abuse, mistreatment, or neglect that a child or adult experiences from a family member. That can also be an intimate relationship. Now, we often think about family violence in terms of children who are experiencing violence. And again, it can be any of these different forms of violence. It doesn't always have to be physical violence. And so often if there is intimate partner violence and then children are introduced to that family dynamic, that they will also bear witness to that violence. And so that's family violence. But we can also think about family violence in terms of older adults. So if someone in your family is taking care of a grandparent, an auntie, an uncle, and they're neglecting them, they're withholding uh, care, maybe health treatments, things like that, then that would be a way in which power and control plays out in family violence, right? We can also think about how these things are structural. So, first of all, families in and of themselves are social institutions. They organize our everyday lives, right? So, the places we live, the people we live with, the income and economic um, dynamics at play for our household, those are all dictated by family structures. So, then we can start to think about how within family dynamics and within our society, there are certain expectations about, let's say, what type of roles different people and families should play based off their gender, their age, other aspects of their identity, right? And so we can start to see how oftentimes when we think about intimate partner violence and family violence, because men carry privilege in our society, oftentimes women experience intimate partner violence as victims and survivors, and men are often the perps, right? And again, here is a link to Deaf Hope. This is also linked on our week 3 page on LaLima, but this just goes over some of the detailed information regarding the deaf community and how they can potentially experience intimate partner violence. Now, one thing I want to draw attention to is the fact that the video you had to watch from Deaf Hope is all in American Sign Language. And so it actually is not in, there's no voiceover sub. And one of the reasons why I did it that way is so that we can start to think about how whenever folks who use American Sign Language are in a class at UH Manoa, they have to go through the process of ensuring that they have closed captions for the videos they watch. If anything, if there's PowerPoint slides, if anything is text related, then folks who can't see might need to have text readers and things like that. And so imagine having to navigate those situations all the time, every day for every single class you're taking. And so I hope that by having to watch that video, not necessarily fully understand what's going on, and then go back and download that transcript of what's being said in American Sign Language, you can start to better empathize with the deaf community and what it might be like to have to deal with that anytime your professor assigns a video, which, of course, in this class is a lot. And fun fact, that's why all of my videos I make are available on YouTube, because YouTube provides automatic free closed captioning. So that helps make things more accessible. All right, moving right along and sort of moving away from the power and control wheel, I want to look at family and structural violence more from a different way. But in order to do that, first we need to come up with a definition for family that we can all agree upon. So sociologists typically define family as the people you live with and who you have intimate ties to. This is often conceptualized based on blood relations and marriage, but we can also think about some other family dynamics that could potentially be at play. So when I took intro sociology as an undergraduate, the professor I had, he liked to use the Golden Girls as an example, which I know is a little bit dated at this point, but because of nostalgic pop culture stuff, I feel like most students still know what the Golden Girls is. If you're unfamiliar, it's a TV show about retired women living in Florida. And so there's four of them living together in a house. Two of the women are a mother and a daughter, so they are blood relations. But the other two women living in the house, they're not blood related or married to anyone else. And yet they identify as being a family unit. So there's an episode where one of the characters, Blanche, she's in the hospital. She wakes up from surgery and she's asking for her girls and she's really upset. And the doctors and nurses are like, "Oh, your kids are on the way." She had a daughter who didn't live with her, who lived out of state. And she said, "No, no, my girls, my girls." And she's referring to the other three women who live with her, who she identifies as being part of a family with, but they aren't blood relation to her. And so there are some different ways we can think about family dynamics. As far as gender and equity in family, a term that sociologists and feminist scholars often discuss is the cult of domesticity. This is the idea that within our society, we often romanticize traditionally feminine work as being something girls and women should participate in, and it should be this good thing that women are participating in. And yet we know that this labor is more often than not unpaid and unappreciated. Now, Arlie Hochschild talks about this in terms of the second shift. So in the second shift, this was a very classic book at this point, written in, I believe, 1989. Yes, 1989. She said, well, women actually work two shifts. They work their shift at their job, their 9 to 5 usually, and then they come home and they have their domestic responsibilities. So they have to do the cooking, the cleaning, the child rearing. And even when their husbands or other men within their family are helping out with some of these second shift domestic responsibilities, the work is still gendered. So women do things that have to be taken care of on a regular basis. They're doing things like cooking all the meals, they're doing the laundry, things like that. Versus men are doing things like yard work, mowing the lawn, taking out the trash. These tasks take less time and are often not things that need to be done on a daily, sometimes 3 times a day if we're thinking about preparing meals, right? And so she actually broke down how much time men and women take doing this second shift stuff around the house. And women, by and large, are doing way more time working the second shift. Now, we can also think about this in terms of unpaid labor. So, Arlie Hochschild wasn't so concerned with the financial aspects of the second shift. But there are some other feminist scholars, particularly Marxist feminist scholars, who were concerned about the lack of pay, recognition, and support we have for women's work in our society. So folks like Sylvia Federici said, hey, wait a minute, this work is not being paid. Women aren't getting paid for this work. And yet think about how much money a household can save if a woman is a stay-at-home mom and her family, her husband and she don't have to pay for childcare, right? I know my sister lives in Chicago and she can't find a job in her field. She has a bachelor's degree. She worked in nonprofits for over a decade. She can't find a job in her field that pays more than the cost of childcare for one child. Just one child is over $30,000 a year. And my understanding is that here in Hawaii, childcare, daycare can actually be even more expensive than that. And so we don't quantify women's unpaid labor, things like taking care of children full time. We see them as having $0 contribution to the family household. But really, if we think about this unpaid labor they're doing and how much money they're potentially saving their family unit, cooking and cleaning and child rearing, that adds up. All right. So some other things to think of in terms of family and structural violence. We can think about heteronormativity. So going back again to the LGBTQ plus community. In our society, in contemporary Western society, we still normalize heterosexuality, which is sexual and romantic attraction between a man and a woman. And so, although we have same sex marriage very recently, mind you, in the United States nationwide, and in fact, in Hawaii, same sex marriage was legalized much earlier than a lot of parts in the country. We know that the norm in Western society is for heterosexuality, right? Sorry, heteronormativity. And so we still know that that's the norm within our society. This means that folks who identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus community, they're going to experience potentially structural violence. So they may experience discrimination when it comes to work, when it comes to housing. And certainly if you pass for being part of the you know, you don't quote look gay, you don't look trans, you pass, and then perhaps you won't experience as much structural violence. But then, of course, we can think about that in terms of the amount of privilege a particular person carries, right? So we can think about family dynamics and what it might mean to be a same-sex couple trying to raise a family, sending your kids to school and that sort of thing, and the potential discrimination you might experience. And then there's also a lot of wedding and marriage stereotypes that are still mainstream within our society. So oftentimes the expectation is that when two people get married, they're going to have the white wedding, right? They're going to have this big, expensive wedding. The woman is going to wear a beautiful white dress. The man's going to have the fancy tuxedo on. You're spending all this money. You're doing all this consumption for only one day, and it's contributing significantly to capitalism. And so, in particular, feminist Marxists would say, well, why are we feeding into this wedding industrial complex? And in fact, we can start to think about how much pressure is placed on same sex couples to be heteronormative in the sense that, oh, we need to have an expensive white wedding as well. And why is it that we don't support folks who perhaps instead of taking thousands of dollars and spending it on this white wedding, why don't we instead, value spending that money on, say, a down payment for a house, right? And yet we know that, there's this expectation within our society that folks are going to have these big fancy weddings. And even if you don't want to have that traditional wedding, but you just want to go get married at the justice of the peace, that in and of itself costs money, right? And so we can think about poor folks who are in a committed relationship together and they're living together, but they don't want to spend the couple $100s it might take to go down to the courthouse and have and get married. because they're living paycheck to paycheck and they're worried about putting food on the table for their kids. And so then think about some of the benefits and privileges that come with being in a marriage, right? So in Hawaii, domestic partnership, we actually have a lot of rights here. But think about how much easier it is to get healthcare benefits, retirement benefits, Social Security, things like that, if you're actually married to your long-term partner that you live with. All right. So that's enough on structural violence and family. Here is a link for your exit pass. It is also on our Laulima page, but I want to real quick go to the rubric for your power and control wheel. And again, this is what your power and control wheel should be based off of, and then you'll just be making revisions and updating it for a marginalized community and within that contemporary setting. So as an example, there have been a lot of power and control wheels written as early as late 90s, early 2000s that are specific to the LGBTQ plus community. And in fact, the article that the journal article you have to read this week is from 2008, and it's about just that. But we know that things have changed significantly for the LGBTQ plus community from 2008 to now, right? Same-sex marriage is legal. There's much more housing and workplace protection for that community. So the way power and control and structural violence might look like for same-sex couples is potentially different, right? But yet power can still be wielded in similar ways because you can do things like outing your same-sex partner at work, right? Or something like that, just as an example. So real quick, I'm gonna pull up the power and control wheel. Oh, just kidding, that is the wrong class. Where's 446? Give me just a second. Okay, so I will pull up. Here's your power and control wheel rubric. You can see this assignment is worth 25 points. There's also details about this assignment on the syllabus. And then you can see you're being graded on organization, content, concepts, and terminology, and then connections and knowledge of the relationships among concepts. So make sure you're taking concepts from that scholarly journal article you read this week, the video you watched from Deaf Hope, the power and control wheel Deaf Hope created, and then my lecture and PowerPoints, as well as the discussion leader projects. Take all that information and incorporate it into your power and control wheel. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. I look forward to seeing everyone's assignment. Have a great week.